Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of LMRVille's Model Railroad. In this episode, we're going to focus on the bridge that connects both benchworks on either side of the room. This part of the build was real critical and pretty nerve-wracking. The bridge had to be perfectly aligned. The hinges had to be installed just in the right spots so the bridge can tilt up and down, come down in its resting spots just where it needs to be, so all the tracks can lay just to where they were supposed to be in the alignment process. For the bridge structure itself, I decided to use an oak board because of its natural strength and longevity, and I figured it could put up with a lot of the abuse compared to other types of wood. The total distance from one side to the other the bridge had to span was only 28 inches. I decided to place the hinge portion of the bridge on the right side or on the peninsula of the benchwork. I figured it'd be a whole lot easier for the construction phase of it and whenever I had to do any kind of maintenance or any kinds of adjustments. Now, even though putting the hinges on the peninsula side provided ease of access on all two sides, it presented another challenge because of the angle that it had to be installed. And that was quite challenging, and it took me a little while to set everything up. Back in my construction days when we used string lines to either set up fence posts or concrete forms, I used that same technique to align the hinge box with the other side. The construction material I used for this build was pretty much all either 1x4 or 1x6 select pine, quite a bit of 3/4 inch plywood maple, and everything was glued, and I used either 1 1/4 drywall screws. I know, drywall screws, there's no drywall here, but I used it anyway and it worked just fine. I also used 1 1/2 inch torque 25 deck screws, which really secured everything down, and of course a lot of the joinery I used pocket holes. Now that I've gotten this far, I got to start looking at adding the hinges, the bridge itself, the linear actuator, and all the components that's going to make this thing work. So with that said, I designed a footing or a leg or a structure that's going to really support that portion of the peninsula or the benchwork, and also support the actuation and the movement of the bridge as I activate it. As we turn it on and turn it off, it goes up and it comes back down. And throughout its life, it's going to have a structure there that's going to support all that movement. The actuator I installed was a 12-volt, 10-inch stroke linear actuator, which was really heavy duty, at a 330-pound maximum lift. The only thing with it was it wasn't very fast. Good thing about the actuator being slow would be that if I had a really fast one, it'd probably be flinging some scenery off the bridge. The actuator came with internal limit switches, which controlled its extended and retracted limits. The internal limit switches in the actuator worked well. However, when the bridge was in the upright position with the linear actuator retracted, I had to install an external micro switch to stop the actuation before it reached its full limit. If not, I run the risk of probably ripping the bridge apart. Here's a wiring diagram for an external limit switch for your linear actuator. In order to activate the bridge to raise and lower, I installed a switch, and the switch that I used is called a double pole double throw. Here's a view of a double pole double throw switch. It shows the functions and how they work. You can see the center lugs provide the power, and then the upper two lugs and the lower two lugs are for your loads. Here's a simple diagram of how I wired the switch in. On the other side of the benchwork where the bridge was going to be lowered onto, I had to put a notch into it so the bridge can rest right inside of that notch and ensure that when it did rest in it, it was constantly in the same position, because it was critical that when the bridge was in the lowered position that the tracks aligned perfectly. Even though the notch worked out fairly well, there was occasions when I did have to kind of nudge it just a little bit. So what I did to rectify that is I installed an alignment pin that you can see here. And what that did was it just aligned the bridge as it came down, and it pulled it right into the perfect position. One thing I had to take into consideration was how to prevent trains from running off the benchwork or off their tracks if I happened to forget to lower the bridge. And with that, what I did was I installed 2 micro switches as safety switches, and they work by interfacing with the track feeders. Here you'll see how these switches work. Bridge is down, the switch is closed, and the tracks are energized. Bridge goes up, the switch opens, and the tracks are de-energized. Switches on both sides of the bridge, protecting both sides of the benchwork tracks. Now with the electrical and bridge components completed, I need to start working on putting together the bridge scenery. The bridge I decided to use was a double track railroad arch Pratt truss bridge. Now this gave me the longest span. It was about 23 inches. I needed something that was going to be 28 inches, so I was still a deficit there of about 5 inches. But at the time, it was the longest bridge I could find. If there are any longer bridges, I wouldn't mind knowing about it. If you want to make a comment on the bottom, if you know of any other bridges that are longer than that. I had to do a little bit of bridge kit bashing. Since the truss bridge is self-supporting, I had to modify the base so it would rest on the oak board. I also modified the oak board so the truss bridge can sit on it just right and blend the scenery as best as possible. The one thing I didn't do was take any pictures of the painting of the truss bridge. I had just bought the paints and I just got my hand on a couple of airbrushes and I started to paint the bridge and weather it as best as I possibly could. It came out okay. I think it could have looked a little bit better, but it didn't come out the way I kind of envisioned it. But nonetheless, as time went on, I did make some corrections and I did weather it a little bit more once it was installed. I installed the bridge, laid out the track, aligned everything in, secured everything on, and I ran a little test. Everything ran pretty smooth. The safety switches energized and de-energized just the way they were supposed to, and the trains ran pretty good. Everything worked pretty well, and I was pretty pleased how everything turned out. Thank you very much for watching this episode, and stay tuned for the next episode, which is going to be more of the electrical. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.